So in the last video we made a sort of paper lift effect, but it's quite rigid, and if we have more complex scenarios, even if I'm moving the shadows around a little bit, sometimes it can look a little bit formulaic. So I'm going to show you another technique, and it will help us just create a bit more variation. It can look a bit naff as you're actually constructing it, but once you get the flesh and bones of it worked out, it begins to pull together. So just work through your drawings, and it will come to life. So you need to start off with creating some images to work with, and I would do those in Illustrator. So I've got some, not a particularly great drawing of a parrot and a drawing of a silhouette. So I've just used the pen tool. I've zoomed right in for detail and out for broader strokes, and zoomed right in to do the detail, pen tool all the way around. And I've also brought in some of the other things that we've made during the course. So I brought in the cogs, the initial drawing of the cog once we'd used the Pathfinder to merge the shape together, and then that was the simplified cog we made. And then again I went back to the bare bones of this shape, brought them together, and they just need to be merged in if I'm going to use this. I can also bring in my concentric circles into this drawing as well. So it's the same thing. You need to consider exporting two layers. So you can draw everything in the same layer and it will make all the little sub layers, but the sub layers, remember, are no good. You always have to go to release to layers. So you select everything, fly out menu, release to layers, and then you can name those layers if you want to, and they will be exported out to Photoshop. I've locked everything I don't really need, and I might just come in and see what's happening here, see if we can merge these together. Something like that. So I've got it all in one shape. Probably actually won't use this one, but I'm going to use these two, and we'll leave them all here together. So again, I'm going to export to Photoshop document. You know where you're putting it. Paper face 2. And then remember to write layers as you exit. Make sure that you're in 300 ppi, pixels per inch, and that you're in art optimized, unless it's text that you're working with, and then make it type optimized. If you're working in CMYK, your document is CMYK, you'll be able to write layers in CMYK, but if your document is RGB, you'll be able to write layers in RGB. You can see because my document is CMYK, I can't write layers. It probably would have been better to start in RGB, consider I'm going off, taking this document off to Photoshop. A quick word about my messy edges. So all of this is going to come into Photoshop, and we're going to crop it down in Photoshop. So it really doesn't matter that I've got these kind of messy edges, but what you do need to be careful of is this sort of thing here. Photoshop is going to see all of this, and I either need to crop right in or I could cause myself problems, as you'll see in a moment. But you don't need to use a clipping mask or anything, and in fact that will confuse the issue of the layers. So don't apply a clipping mask to this, just send it out as it is. Now you're going to end up with something like this, which looks quite sophisticated, but it's really just a series of shadows and dropped fills with bevels and inner shadows and textures applied and clipped to various layers. So what you will need is a bunch of recycled paper. So there's plenty of this for free on the internet. Do make sure it's a really good size and it doesn't have watermarks on it, unless you're prepared to either purchase it or get rid of the watermarks yourself. You need just really good textured paper. And this is all recycled paper and handmade papers. So I'm going to do a few things just to tidy up. Turn off the bird. I'm going to get rid of the light bulb. I probably won't use it. And I need to crop this down now. So I'm going to use a cropping tool to just move in. And just be very, very careful when you're doing this, that you don't create problems later on down the line. I originally cropped my document to something like this. And you can see I've left myself a little problem area there. So if I look at this document, you can see what's happening. So just be in control and either make sure your drawing is adequate in Illustrator or you crop it right down in Photoshop. So that's going to do me for the moment. Now, everything is in its separate layer, and we have the backgrounds in a sub-layer, a set of sub-layers. So I'm going to turn off some of these for the moment and just work on these landscape layers. I'm going to double click to create styles. Now there's a few possible routes through this. First of all, you could just create a drop shadow and then just make sure that you can see that drop shadow. So I'm going to spread it a little bit, make the size a bit bigger. And that's working okay. You know, spin the angle around so that you can see it. And that's actually quite okay and quite adequate, except for the fact that it's not really giving us a paper lift effect because it's formulaic and regimental right across. So the shadow never changes, and we need to find a way to just make it change a little bit. You can see here I've emphasized the turn of the hill, and in particular you can see on this one, as the hill's turning, the shadow then disappears and then reappears over here, as if it's the paper bending and the light refracting through onto the paper. So it's a little bit more complex than simply a shadow which appears to be plonked on. But we all know we can take these shadows off. So I could right click and create layer. So remember, what I'm doing is I'm going to the effects and I'm right clicking on the effects to create a layer of my drop shadow. So now I can distort that. And the way I'm going to distort it is I'm going to say Command T to grab the transform tool, and I'm going to say right click to create a warp. And the warp is just going to allow me to play with where exactly I want that shadow to go. So I can create a bit of variation there. Another way I could have done it is I could have distorted the shadow a little bit using zigzag. So that might have allowed me just to create a bit of interruption. So that's one possibility, and now my shadow's on a separate layer. I can also kind of nudge it and make it more kind of weighted. So it's coming over the brow of the hill now, as if the paper is lifting. A second way is to take the shape. So I'm going to Command click, create a fresh layer, and then I'm going to say Option delete. And what that's going to do is fill that selection, and I'm going to just drop the layer underneath. So basically all I've done is copied. I mean, I could have copied this and added a color overlay. Any way you can get to a black, okay? But my route through, just going to show you again, is to hold Command, click on the layer you want to address, make a fresh layer, and on the keyboard, Option, Delete. That fills that layer with whatever is in the foreground. So if it was a colour, it would fill it with the foreground. If I wanted to fill it with the background colour, then I just use Command Delete. So if I just go Command Delete, you'll see it will fill with white. So, but basically I want a shadow. So I'm going to take the shape of it and Option Delete to get the shadow, place it underneath. And I'm just going to move it a little bit so I can see it, and I'm going to push it so it's a little bit disjointed and coming over the edge. And then I'm going to soften it by adding a Gaussian blur. And you'll see this gives you a sort of deeper shadow than this kind of shadow. And then of course you can tone down the opacity, work with blends and so on. So I'm just going to tone this down a little bit. You don't want it too soft or it stops giving you the paper lift effect. But I could tone down the opacity or work with the blend modes, something like color burn, and that will let the color come through. Do the same on this layer too. So create color burn, and that will allow the color to come through, or multiply to darken it, and so on. So you can experiment with blend modes. So I'll just do this one more. I'm going to take the shape. I'm going to create a fresh layer, and then I'm going to Option Delete to fill with black, put it underneath, deselect, and then I'm going to work with just moving it forward a bit so I create an uneven line and create a Gaussian blur and work with my blend modes. And you might want it to get sort of darker and darker, or the opposite, lighter and lighter towards the back. So I'm just going to add to each of these hills a little bit of distortion. So Command T to and then right click to warp, Command T to transform, and then you can introduce a little bit of variation. Leave it like that. So I'm going to do this to all of these hills. I've added the same sort of shadow here. I think I'm going to treat these a little bit differently, just to refresh you on another technique. And then if you go to the next video just for the finishing touches.